This roundtable is entitled Understanding the Intersection, Smart Rural Transportation Investment. And we're going to look at transportation's role in rural economies and explore how federal transportation policies can better meet community needs. Matthew Dalbey, director of the Dalbey? Sorry, Dalbey? Matt, director of the Office of Community Revitalization at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, has stepped up to moderate this roundtable, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Matt. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Can you all hear me? Is that good? So before I get started, I just want to mention, earlier I asked this question, and I mentioned to Greg Taven, that I had been in Fargo. It was a big deal in the ice rinks of suburban Washington, D.C. to see somebody skating around in one of these green North Dakota State University jerseys. I think I still have it, but my youngest is 15 now. He doesn't fit into it any longer. Anyway, so I have been here. I'm looking forward to this panel. Let me just quickly introduce the panelists, and then I'll explain why the EPA guy is here very quickly. So first is Ann Reinke, right here from the Department of Transportation. She, 5 weeks ago, joined the department. 5 months. 5 months ago, sorry, months, weeks. Joined. Bill. But anyway, so she joined the Department of Transportation as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs. And we'll hear from her first, but let me keep going. Bill Panos is the recently named Secretary of the Department of Transportation here, or Director, you call it, here in North Dakota. Bill, you started just last month, right? As in yesterday? Last week, right. And then Kevin Adam, who works for the Rural Transportation Advocacy Council, which is a coalition of all the rural, regional, county, and municipal governments in Arizona, and he focuses on transportation infrastructure development. So, great, Kevin. So quickly, why is the EPA guy here? So I think, as many of you know, our agency, the mission is to protect human health and the environment. This is mostly done through regulatory work or through like Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. But as we all know, and as we are even talking about right here, how we use our land across the country impacts the quality of our environment. Also, economic prosperity equips communities with the tools that they need to protect the environment in ways that they see fit, coming up with community-led solutions to protect the environment. And so my office focuses on helping communities identify economic drivers and revitalize their existing places, their main streets, their neighborhoods down near Main Street, reusing existing infrastructure, previously used buildings and undeveloped sites for future growth and development. One of the things that we realized since the Great Recession of 2008 and 2007 was that we couldn't do this work in places that didn't have economic drivers or economic futures, right? So we started teaching ourselves how to do local economic development. And we've done this with many. Administration is trying to work as a federal family to help promote economic development in communities that have seen economic decline. And one of the ways that we're doing that is through what is called the White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council, which is supporting the Opportunity Zones Initiative, which came out of the 2017 tax bill. Actually today, HUD and the White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council rolled out a new website. It's called opportunityzones.gov, and it's a place that you can go and look how the federal family is supporting the tax incentives that are in these opportunity zones, which are 8,700 census tracts across the country, 40% of which are in rural communities. Last thing I want to say is just something quickly about my program. Most of the work that my program does is around technical assistance in building the capacity of communities to identify economic drivers and revitalize existing places so that they can be thriving and vibrant, reuse infrastructure, as I mentioned just before. We do most of this work with other federal agencies. We've worked with Department of Transportation, USDA, HUD, Centers for Disease Control, FEMA, Appalachian Regional Commission, the Forest Service, and some of the branded type of technical assistance workshops that we support are things like Local Food, Local Places, which is helping communities identify their local and regional agricultural systems and use that economic driver to revitalize their downtowns. We have a program that we used to support with help from USDA Rural Development. It was called Cool and Connected, and it was helping communities take this new driver of an economy, broadband, that was coming into their town and use it to revitalize existing places and develop their main streets. And we've just started a new program called the recreation economy in rural communities. And this is helping rural communities that are near amenities and assets like trails and snowmobiling areas and things like that. How do you get that economy to help lead to economic revitalization? If you're interested in what we do, you can see our work at epa.gov/smartgrowth, one word. But the bottom line for this panel, and it's the bottom line that we recognize in the work that we're doing in trying to protect human health and the environment, is that transportation investments can work for or against community visions, right? Community goals and communities' futures. So I'm hoping that in this panel we can talk about how we can do more of the former and less of the latter. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Anne at this point. We're just going to work our way down. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I also have Sean Poole, who's our Senior Intergovernmental Affairs officer here with me. So what is Intergovernmental Affairs? Deputy Assistant Secretary Intergovernmental Affairs has to be the longest title I've ever heard. But basically, it's a long way of saying we're here to be an ambassador to the states and the localities and the DOTs and the legislators, et cetera. So we have a great job because we don't have to deal with Congress most of the time. We actually deal with happy and pragmatic people who are trying to come up with solutions for transportation projects in their states. So the rural initiative that the Western Governors Association has broached is something that is near and dear to the Secretary's heart, to the Department's heart, and something that we are embracing as well. We know the critical role that the rural communities have had in transportation. Most communities grew up around transportation, so whether it's taking people from city to city or taking goods from industries like the ag industry and lumber industry, et cetera, to the places that need them, we know that there is a critical role for the rural communities. But we also know that there is somewhat of an imbalance as it relates to safety. So 45% of accidents occur on rural roads, even though that represents about a fifth, rural population is about a fifth of the nation's population. That is striking. And as you know, or have you been told, the Secretary's #1 priority for her department's term is safety. And so how do we correct that? And furthermore, when you think from the second priority of the Secretary is to rebuild the nation's infrastructure. And what we found was 80% of the most poorly conditioned bridges were in rural areas. So again, the Secretary came in 2017 and said, what can we do? We had noticed, and this is not to malign the previous administration, but there had been somewhat of a disparity in the grants that were given out. It was tilted more urban than rural. And so the Secretary's sort of first job was to correct that imbalance. And so through the BUILD program, she was able to direct dollars to really underserved communities that hadn't had an opportunity to receive grant money. And the BUILD, if you aren't familiar, is a small grant program that we have the opportunity to administer through an appropriated amount every year. And this year it's $900 million. And it goes to those communities that may just need a little bit of money to make a project actually work, come to fruition. I'll get back to BUILD in a minute, but one of the things that strikes me is we have a lot of meetings with lots of local communities. We met with a mayor from Moss Point, Mississippi last week, which I know is a long way away from here, but he wanted to apply for a BUILD grant, and his project is just a connector road. I mean, his road dead ends into another road, and he wants to connect the two. It's pretty simple, but it's nowhere on Mississippi DOT's radar. And again, not because they're not interested, but they don't have the funds. It's just not on their radar. It's a small project. He doesn't have any money for a grant writing operation, not one person. So we tried to advise him and basically said, I guess I'll have to write the grant myself. I mean, here is the mayor as a young guy. He doesn't really have a huge team. He's doing the best he can. And so we are cognizant of that at the department, and that's what we're trying to address. One of the things we have is, as I mentioned, is the BUILD program. And so we have $900 million this year. We're right in the middle of the evaluation phase of the BUILD program. The projects were submitted July 15th. And there were about 667 projects with requested amount of $9.7 billion. So you remember it's 900 million, so that's 10 times oversold. But that goes to show you the critical need that is met. So when we, I think I told you with Build last year, we really tilted heavily towards rural. Congress told us we have to do it evenly, 50-50 split. So 450 million goes to urban projects, 450 million goes to rural projects. The max amount for a grant is $25 million. Again, we're now in senior evaluation stage. We hope to make the awards by November 12th. That's the statutory deadline. But what we're trying to do is make sure the best projects get the most funding. And we have a luxury of having a number of wonderful projects because we are oversold. What else are we doing? So we know, too, that while loans are the kind of sexy stuff, they're also, I mean, while grants are the sexy stuff, we also can provide loans. So last year we started the Build America Bureau started the Rural Loan Initiative, which is basically trying to make loans more accessible to rural communities. And so we have a loan program called TIFIA, and you typically have to have a $50 million loan ask. And so we reduced that to $10 million. And instead of having the interest rate at the Treasury rate, it's half the Treasury rate. And so what does that do? That's basically trying to make dollars more accessible. The Build America Bureau was started as part of the Surface Transportation Act called the FAST Act that passed back in 2015. And their sole goal is to try to allocate loan dollars that are low interest, of long term, so you can get a 30 to 35-year loan, to communities which may not have necessarily thought about it, but if they have a way to kind of self-help, it may make sense for them. The Build America Bureau, as a matter of fact, is coming to North Dakota. We've talked to Jane Berger about having an opportunity to meet with those folks who might avail themselves upon a loan, who might have projects that make sense for them to apply for a loan. And that's our whole goal, is to expand the universe of those who have perhaps never thought about a loan but would like to think about it. Maybe it actually makes sense for them. While I know we don't just have North Dakota here, I think what has been helpful, though, is that North Dakota has been able to succeed, and we have been able to award some projects to North Dakota that repairs things like the Jackrabbit Highway. It's called the Jackrabbit Highway. Is that what it's called? Oh, you just got here a week ago.
Yeah.
The Jackrabbit Road Corridor. So 2 out of the 4 phases have received build grants. And then we have also been able to look at addressing the bridges that I mentioned in my sort of overlay of comments. There was a grant that is addressing 18 bridges that need to be repaired. And then finally, I'd say, you know, we are always interested in innovation, and so North Dakota has been at the cornerstone of innovation in terms of the use of drones, and we, in fact, had sent someone out to a drone conference here last month. Something that we're excited about. We don't want to stand in the way of innovation. We want to make sure it's implemented safely. So we're happy to see that North Dakota is looking at that and the use of drones for whatever it is. If it's, you know, agriculture, if it's road inspection, whatever, however they want to use it. We're excited about what the possibilities are. So I look forward to your questions, and thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Ann. Bill?
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and we're a little bit after lunch, so I'll try and make this as quick as I can. A big thank you to Governor Burgum and WGA for inviting me to be part of this important panel. I love to be on panels with USDOT because I always hear about things that they are doing as our partner in states like North Dakota, and it's always great to see. And they're evolving and they're changing, and they're doing things that help rural states. These issues about TIFIA and the issues about rural state set-asides for some of these grant programs, they didn't exist 5 years ago. This secretary and this administration is doing a great job being able to bring dollars to rural states across the country. especially here in North Dakota, and so we're a beneficiary from that. And the staff, they were shaking their head, it is Jackrabbit Road Corridor, so I wanted to make sure I said that. So I'm what Ben Winchester would call a newcomer to North Dakota. Today we're going to talk not about the entire mission of DOT, North Dakota DOT, but of a specific thing, which is our education and community partnerships, especially in communities like Fargo and our other small communities and small cities around the state of North Dakota. Let me give you a little bit of context that'll help. We have about 5,000 bridges in North Dakota. About 3,000 of those are not operated by the state. They're operated by local government, by many of the mayors that I see in the back, by small towns like the one we heard from earlier with the Opera House. They're operated by those communities, which means that DOTs, not just here in North Dakota, but all over the country, have to have strong, significant relationships, partnerships with local communities. And so you see that. You saw it today if you went on the tour with the Fargo Main Street project. This is a partnership between US DOT, the city of Fargo, and the North Dakota State DOT, where we are exchanging science, and we're exchanging funding, and we're exchanging ideas and thoughts about planning and community development, and about multimodal transportation for pedestrians and bicycles, and about community and economic development here in Main Street. And so those kinds of things are all part of what DOTs do, what the DOT does certainly here in North Dakota, but what DOTs do throughout the West and throughout the United States. And it's not just specific to rural states, but across the country, even in rural parts of more populated states. But certainly it's a great example here in North Dakota. So when communities are making these decisions about roads, oftentimes they are like other communities around the country, and they're looking outside of their core areas for development opportunities. And oftentimes these decisions are made when communities may not be able to consider all of the true costs and the full impact of some of these changes to the communities. And one of the roles that the North Dakota DOT and other DOTs can have, state DOTs, can have is working early on with those communities at helping them to make the right economic decisions, the right infrastructure decisions, as they make these decisions about not only reinvesting in their Main Street, but also these considerations of moving outside into suburban areas or into farmland or into green fields. And so we do that a great deal. And our communities here have been great partners. And our team from North Dakota, who you saw, by the way, they just did a great job today on the tour, who you saw earlier today, do a great job of working with communities at helping to understand the full cost impacts of those kinds of decisions. We know that in many cases, it's about 2.5 times more expensive over time to develop outside of a core area like a Main Street than it is to redevelop the Main Street itself. And so we help them to identify the return on their investment, the return on their community investment, those public dollars that are so they're so precious that we spend them in a way which is not only in the short-term interests of that community, but in the long-term interests as well. And the communities have been really responsive. They've been really helpful, I think, and it's not just here in North Dakota, but across the country. Communities have been really good about working in partnership with USDOT and the states to be able to work on these decisions and to look at return on investment as they make the decisions as they move forward. And so I just wanted to touch a little bit on that. I didn't want to say more. We'll take questions, but it is one of several missions that DOTs have, and North Dakota is no exception, where we help partner, educate, and work with our communities as they make these really difficult decisions about where to develop next and where to grow their communities. And again, the governor's initiatives around smart infrastructure, the governor's initiatives here in North Dakota around Main Street have been helpful guides for not only the North Dakota DOT, but all state agencies in helping us work with our great community partners at being able to work through these decisions and make the right decisions for those communities in the state, both short-term and long-term. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and we'll look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Bill. Kevin.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to give you a little bit of background about the Rural Transportation Advocacy Council and what I do. And 20 years ago was the last time in Arizona that transportation officials from across the state came together and had a real earnest discussion as far as what was the appropriate way to distribute the transportation funding that the state DOT had to work with. That was both the federal and state discretionary funding that came to the department. And as you would predict, the biggest challenge to that was the fight between the rural and urban areas. And of course, that was detrimental to both because with transportation planning, you need to be able to reasonably predict what type of revenue you have to work with for the next 5, 10, 20 years in order for it to be effective. And so it was a detriment to everyone having this high level of unpredictability. And so as a result of this meeting, there was a formula that was developed where a set percentage of funding would be provided to the Phoenix metropolitan area, another set percentage to the Tucson area, and then everybody else was essentially lumped together into the third area. And so that was, and it was at the time they called us the 13 other counties. Since then they've been a little bit more diplomatic. We've graduated to Greater Arizona. But that's essentially, at that time, Greater Arizona, the 13 other counties, decided that, well, if we're going to be lumped together, we probably need to do a much better job of coordinating and also keeping a pulse of what's going on at the state capitol as far as transportation is concerned. And so that was the reason for the formation of the organization. And with that, I'm going to give you a story from rural Arizona. Back in June, I was at our state transportation board meeting. Of course, it's the last meeting before the end of the state fiscal year, start of the new one. And they needed to approve the 5-year construction plan update. And there was one state board member, it's a board of 7, that was making an impassioned plea to have a project amended into the plan. And this wasn't your typical political appointee. This was somebody who had a tremendous amount of background, civil engineer, owned his own site preparation consulting company, but prior to that, he was retired county administrator in Gila County, a rural county in Arizona. And prior to being the administrator, he was the public works director. So he was very intimately familiar with the needs in his particular region. And a little bit of background, like a lot of states, were highly urbanized, and on weekends and during the summers, there's a mass exodus, particularly from the Phoenix area in all directions. You go to the south and the west to hit the beaches in California and Mexico, or you go north and east to get up in the mountains with the nicer climate and the lakes, and in the winter skiing. And so the rural roads are basically pounded come weekends and the summers. And there's one road, the Beeline Highway, which essentially goes out to the northeast from Phoenix, that over the last 25 years has seen some major expansions to try to accommodate this seasonal traffic that it experiences. And there's a stretch about 90 miles north of Phoenix where you have that hourglass effect, where you go from 2 lanes in each direction to 1 for a couple of miles and then back to 2. And as you would imagine, that creates a huge bottleneck, tremendous congestion, which has a major impact on the quality of the experience of being able to recreate or vacation. It also creates serious safety concerns as well. This is a very windy stretch of road. It's heavily forested, so the visibility isn't that great. And so a lot of accidents and a lot of fatalities. And so safety concerns are at a max there. In addition, there's no alternative routes. And so first responders cannot get not only to accidents in this little bottleneck area, but to get to accidents on the other side. And then we also have the U.S. Forest Service who's involved here, because this stretch of highway also provides access to a dip site for the helicopters that come in with fire suppression and actually load up with water and suppression materials to fight fires. And the Forest Services have difficulty manning this station, and we do have quite a few. We've had catastrophic forest fires in this region of the state, and so big concern all around. And the state director of the Department of Transportation, essentially his feedback to this plea for the inclusion of this project was that we do a data-driven analysis of all the needs across the state. We couldn't agree with you more that this project is vital for the economy of these communities up there, for the public safety, for the ability to enjoy the recreational opportunities that are in the region. But your project ranks 38th on the list of projects that we can't fund because of the lack of resources. So there are 37 other projects that actually had more pressing needs on them. It's just a dramatic, it's just so indicative of the lack of funding that's available to maintain and grow our infrastructure. Our DOT updated their long-range plan a couple of years back and found that we had a $30.5 billion shortfall when you compared the anticipated revenues to the needs, and that's just on the state system. That comes out to only addressing about 42% of the needs that are out there over the next 25 years. For that portion of the funding that's directed to Greater Arizona, our DOT is moving towards a maintenance-only type operation. For the next 5 years, we have roughly one project out there, and as you heard from the governor earlier today in his meeting with my governor, we're the fastest growing state in the nation. The Phoenix area is the fastest growing metropolitan area. So to have that level of growth and to have a moratorium on new construction is unfathomable. But on top of that, even though we're directing every possible dollar that we can to maintenance, we don't even have adequate funding to fully address our maintenance needs. We fully anticipate that there will be a deterioration in pavement conditions over the 25 years. And so, you know, the message that I wanted to leave with you is that our infrastructure is in serious condition and problems, and I think that's probably more so in rural areas than the urban. And you know, you go back to the last presidential campaign, and you had candidate Clinton coming up with a $1 trillion plan, and candidate Trump comes back with, well, here's your $1 trillion, and I'll see you $1 trillion. So we were sort of outbidding one another. I think there was a tremendous amount of energy and support to invest in the infrastructure, and we've kind of gotten away from that. And we can talk and debate over, you know, how can we more efficiently better use the funding. But again, when you can only address 42% of your needs out there, there are going to be some very glaring needs that go unmet. So sorry to provide the doom and gloom, but I really think that's where we are.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Ann. This is time to open up to questions. I do have a couple questions that I would ask as folks are deciding what their questions are going to be. I think one thing that is really interesting to me, I mean, I've been in this field 20 years or so, and I think more than 20 years ago, the you wouldn't have heard this conversation. I think what you're hearing, right, is, you know, two people from federal agencies, somebody from a state agency, somebody at a sort of an advocacy organization talking about how important it is to listen to communities and identify, you know, help those communities identify what they want at that level, and then make policy decisions and programmatic decisions when you hear what they have, you know, what their needs are. And so under Secretary Chow, right, the DOT is listening to the fact that in the previous administration, rural communities were left out, so you're listening. And I think that's what you're all trying to do here in North Dakota, and that's, you know, the maintenance side of your conversation, at least in Arizona, seems to be built on that. So we're trying to listen to communities, and, you know, but then we have all these pressures, right? I mean, you know, we heard just the previous panel talked about the changing agricultural economy here in North Dakota, and it's changing in many other places. Transportation infrastructure investments have been responsive to what the economy has been like for generations, right? I mean, we have small rural towns because those towns basically solved transportation problems for the agricultural economy that was there, right? You needed a place to bring things to market. You needed a place to add value to those. You needed a place for people to live who worked on farms and things like that. So we're putting a lot of pressure on our infrastructure spending, right? From the maintenance, growth, and things like that. And we haven't even begun to address like what the economy is going to be like in the 21st century, right? When are we going to do that? And does anybody have any thoughts on like the 21st century with changing agriculture, the 21st century with telemedicine, online education and things like that? How can we begin to address that at all? I mean, and what type of investments might we be making in order to address what the economy is going to be like in the 21st century? I think the governor has sort of described how part of the economy of North Dakota in the future is going to be on Main Street in towns, right? And so that's why we heard about the way Main Street is being changed here in Fargo, right? So that's one answer. But what are some of the other answers that we could probably bring to this question of, you know, supporting with transportation infrastructure the economy of the 21st century?
Yeah, I'll take a start at it. So. One of the most exciting things that the department has been involved in is monitoring the testing and development of automated vehicles. And so we actually just awarded a small grant program for automated vehicle deployment testing in various proving grounds. And while we don't know when that future will be, and you know, we're not sure how it will all come to pass, we're excited about what it means. It means greater mobility for those who possibly don't have access to vehicles, and it means greater safety. And so the future of automated vehicles, we were actually able to see a demonstration. Sean and I went to Las Vegas, and if you have ever been to Las Vegas, they have a big consumer technology conference there every year. I've never been, but one of the vestiges of the consumer technology conference was that they have an automated vehicle going down Las Vegas Boulevard. And so what they've done is they've have all the signals synchronized to work with the technology using radar, LiDAR, whatever, so that it can stop, it can start, and it can change lanes or pass, all without an operator, hands-free. So you have an operator sitting in the car, in the driver's side, but not actually touching the steering wheel. And so what does that mean? That means for our future that we've essentially exponentially developed a way for people to get from place to place with fewer cars and with fewer drivers. And so that's exciting. And certainly the department wants to be part of that process to make sure it's done safely, but make sure it's done with the eye towards innovation.
So, if I may, so I've worked on this a little bit. I'm not so new in North Dakota, but in Wyoming and with other states around the United States. We call this idea of the integration of technology, smart infrastructure, and the integration of technology in our transportation system sort of the third component infrastructure of transportation here in the United States and around the world. I mean, the first really was back in 1917, and then an injection of dollars in the Eisenhower administration, the building of our roads, the building of this great interstate highway system, the best interstate highway system in the world here in the United States. Now, some would argue that we need to repair it more. Some would argue that we need to fund that repair of it more. I think everybody who is engaged in this dialogue would probably do that. The second is vehicles. Vehicle technology has been incredibly advanced and has moved quickly into the area of automation, as you just described, but more importantly, just basic safety technology. Things like seatbelts and airbags and those kinds of things have been developing over the last few decades. Those are the first two, and the third is the integration of technology into our infrastructure and the ability of those vehicles to talk to the infrastructure and vice versa. This kind of opportunity has not been available to us until now with the Internet of Things, with the ability of sensing technology, with the ability of being able to move data around in the way that we're able to. We're now able to tackle this last bit, as Secretary Chow, I think, would say, this last 37,000 fatalities we see on the highway system. We're able to begin to address that. We're going to break through that 37,000 with this third piece of the infrastructure, the technology piece. We're going to break through and bring down those fatalities finally, after all of these years, because we got stuck there. We brought it down and brought it down throughout the decades, and now we're stuck at that particular place. And I think the economy of the future is going to be around smart infrastructure and this idea of being able to have the infrastructure talk to vehicles and vehicles talk to infrastructure to basically reduce, or in some cases eliminate, fatalities, at least the severity. Crashes may still happen, but the severity of them may be reduced. I'll make one more point about this because it's an exciting topic for me, at least personally, and a lot of the DOT people. Back to vehicles for a second. Some vehicle technology companies, some vehicle companies have made it their mission. Singular mission of Volvo right now is by 2025 to never have a person die in one of their cars ever again. And they're on their way. They're investing billions of dollars in their technology to bring to the consumer market to be able to have that occur. This is not a pie in the sky. This is something they have made their #1 priority. All of their resources are focused around one thing. As companies start to do that, I think we're going to start to see finally this last 37,000 people that we lose every year on this amazing infrastructure that we have, this amazing state highway system, to be reduced. So I think that's part of the economy of the future as we go forward.
And I agree, it is an exciting time with the advancements in technology that we're seeing, and a lot of applications to transportation and a lot of various aspects of it. For rural areas, I'm thinking of the city of Prescott in particular in Arizona, where it's a city of over 50,000, no public transportation system. What we have seen over the last couple of years is Uber and Lyft move in, and it's been a tremendous resource to the city and its residents to be able to have that extra added ability to move around within Prescott. That was and that's the result of an internet. I think we're still, after several decades of having the internet, still trying or finding new innovative ways of using it, and I think Uber and Lyft is one. We're also seeing what we're calling virtual public involvement, where whether it be a transportation plan or a specific project, you're starting to see local entities during their public comment periods reach out online and through social media. And the feedback that I've gotten is that the response has been overwhelming. And I was skeptical at first, as you know, when you get responses or feedback online. People can be rather uninhibited in what they say. But I got to tell you, I'm hearing that these agencies are getting very substantive feedback, and they're also getting it from portions or sections of the population that they're not traditionally getting any feedback from. So they're thrilled with what this virtual public involvement is providing to them.
That's excellent. Are there questions? Yes.
Hi, this is Bill Simons from the Global Pathways Institute at Arizona State. Thank you very much for an excellent panel. I wanted to follow up on the comments that Kevin made from Arizona. I'm also from Arizona. It really gave us a good report card on what the crisis is in Arizona. but I'm wondering if we could take a broader look at the crisis that the rural West is facing. You know, Governor Burgum has done an outstanding job of highlighting the need to provide broadband access across the West so that all of these communities can participate in the 21st century economy. But what we heard today was bits and pieces of the fact that we are not meeting the need when it comes to infrastructure. And it's not just roads and bridges. Another aspect of this is air service. And a couple of years ago, Governor Dugard was chair of WGA. We had a meeting there in Pierre, and they were talking about the inadequacy of air service into South Dakota. For a while, they couldn't even get planes into Pierre, and then somebody else stepped in. It's really inadequate. And the cost of air service into the more remote western towns is also far higher than what people are going to pay if they live in a place like Phoenix. So I wonder, has a scorecard been developed in terms of what those ultimate needs actually are in terms of meeting the infrastructure gap in the West, both in terms of roads and bridges and also for air service?
Can I go? Yeah. Okay. So I'll sort of answer that from a state perspective, only because I just came out of Wyoming and we rebuilt the commercial air service in the state of Wyoming over the last 5 years. And it was quite a job. We had the same situation that South Dakota has, and today they have secured air service for the next 10 years throughout the state of Wyoming. And there were some innovative things that we had to do with the US DOT and the FAA, some of the carriers, major carriers, and then the communities themselves. It was air service in these communities, these rural communities, are not only important to recreation, you know, we call general aviation, not only important to emergencies services, they're important to the basic economy of those communities and a basic normal life. To have a normal life in rural communities, part of what you need to have is an airport. And so that services can come in and people can get out. And we're talking about basic things like getting to medical services that may not be in your small rural town and other kinds of things. So it is an issue for, since deregulation, it is an issue for rural states around the United States, air service. But I think there is an awareness now, not only in the U.S. Congress, but in U.S. DOT and with FAA about that issue. And we are beginning to make, I think, some progress in an understanding that rural air service is a little different than air service in places where it is profitable and there's population centers. And so some of the models are being pretty creative. Wyoming's was pretty creative. I think some other states are doing some very creative things around the country, but I'll stop there and maybe let you talk a little bit about the USDOT perspective about that.
Well, I mean, Bill, you said it, you articulated well, which is this is a partnership. I mean, we perceive that we've got to be at the table with you as you try to figure out what your solutions are, and with the carriers and with FAA. I mean, we're at the Office of the Secretary, but we're one DOT. We want to be part of the solution, recognizing that Congress has a role in this, and we really want to see where we can provide that partnership and that support. And it may be different from each state. I think it does differ from each state, and the conversation will be different. But know that the Secretary is singularly focused on that, of accessibility to what the department can offer.
You know, I think if you look at I believe it's the American Society of Civil Engineers, they continually give the American infrastructure dismal grades. You also, if you look at our global ranking, it continues to go down as far as the quality of our infrastructure compared to other countries across the world. If you look at the rural West, many states over the last 5 years have increased their own infrastructure revenues. Off the top of my head, I can think of Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, Utah, as well as other parts of the country. Indiana, Alabama, just last couple of months ago, increased the gas tax. Georgia. So I believe there's been 28 states in total that have increased their gas tax in the last 5 years. Arizona last time, 1991. I believe the federal the last time was 1993. So, you know, Arizona has to own that we're not keeping up with what other states and localities are doing across the country, which is particularly alarming because of our growth rates. But So we may be in a little bit worse shape than a lot of places, but overall, the picture painted is not very good for the country either.
I had just one more quick point about the question. First of all, Governor Burgum and other governors in the Western United States are asking the right questions, which is, how are we spending the money that we do have? The money, not just from the state, but from the federal government. Are we spending it in the right ways? Are we doing things like Main Street? Are we able to look at the long-term return on investment and are making the right investments in our infrastructure, whether that be transportation or water infrastructure or other kinds of infrastructure? And so we're asking the right questions and being very frugal with public monies as we go through those discussions. But I must say that we have a really strong, and those Western governors really have a strong relationship with the federal government and the U.S. Congress and the U.S. DOT, and they're able to have a presence there. We're a long way away from Washington D.C. out here, and we're not an East Coast state. We're not in the Mid-Atlantic and East Coast, and so presence is what 80% of success out there. And I think our governors have done a really good job of being present back there, being present with the Secretary, being present with the Administrator of EPA, being present with the appropriators in the U.S. Congress at saying states need regulatory flexibility. States need more dollars in these certain areas. I mean, one of the things that was remarkable about the FAST Act, which we're running on right now in transportation agencies, was for the first time in many, many years, the U.S. Congress and the U.S. DOT set aside money for rural states. They set aside money in their discretionary program so that rural states didn't have to compete with larger states in being able to deliver transportation solutions to our local communities. Many of those discretionary programs are being used by the communities, the small communities here in North Dakota today. So I think there's a good dialogue going on. I'm an optimist, so I think there's a really good dialogue going on. I think there's a lot to do. I think if you just look at the quality of our infrastructure, it absolutely needs improving. But I think we're having the right kind of conversation and about using the money wisely and about getting more dollars and more flexibility for states to be able to do that.
That's great. Any other questions? I'm going to ask kind of a follow-up if there's nothing else. I wonder, and I don't know, I wonder if it's, if the infrastructure needs are they're putting such pressure on us, right? And again, the transportation infrastructure supports the economy. I wonder if we can sort of reverse engineer it so that we start to grow the economy based on the infrastructure dollars that we have, right? I mean, I don't want to go sideways of Ben Winchester and do the anecdata sort of thing, but right, there is a lot of room to grow in a lot of towns across the West, across the entire country, right? How do we grow an economy that takes advantage of the fact that our grandparents and great-grandparents made investments in grids, in existing places, in the infrastructure that's already there? Is that possible? And I guess then it's like, who else do we all need to work with if we're making decisions about infrastructure? Is it the Department of Commerce? Is it, who is it? Is it really learning from what the infrastructure needs of this new precision agriculture is, right? And how do we do that? So.
You go first,
Okay.
I'm going to think about it.
Okay. So a couple of different things. One, I love the idea of using what exists. One of the things I didn't mention in my comments before that I really wanted to mention was the opportunity that a state DOT has to work with local communities about return on investment and about investing in redeveloping their urban cores, looking at Main Street initiatives, those kinds of things, is because we have a STIP, a state transportation improvement plan. Every state does. We have to have a long-range plan that has funding for the US DOT to bring in the dollars that it does. In a state like North Dakota, we have an average of 80-20 cost share, which means 80% of the dollars come from the federal government for transportation, and about 20% comes from either local or state resources. Well, that's remarkable. And so they require us to have a long-term plan to do that. And so when we can go out with communities that want to think about where do we grow next? What do we invest in next? 5 years out, 7 years out, 10 years out, and we're able to begin to craft solutions with them that make sense. And so a lot of what we need to do is already here. It's just using it, using the processes that are here, using the policies that are here appropriately, and talking and communicating, because again, as North Dakota is not unlike other states, North Dakota, the vast majority of transportation infrastructure is not sitting under the state authority. It's sitting inside of local communities.
Yeah. And I would say I absolutely agree with that. I mean, one of the things that we have called for, so the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill is going to expire next year, September 30th, 2020. Coincidentally, 2020 is an election year. I don't know if you've heard. So it's going to be a kind of a dicey proposition whether it actually gets reauthorized next year. We're hoping. But we would love to see a bill that's not just 5 years. We would love to see a bill that's 10 years in length, so it could provide communities that stability of knowing we're going to plan into the future what our needs are, and we're not going to have to worry that 5 years hence we're going to have extension after extension after extension. That's not a way to plan a healthy transportation system, and it's not a way to plan a healthy economy. And so what we are advocating for is that we have this long-term source. Of course, the 8,000-pound gorilla is the how to fund it. And while the department eagerly spends money, we don't have money of our own. We must rely on our members of Congress. And we have a fabulous relationship with our members of Congress, but they themselves have not fixed on a way to fund it. In the meantime, we were appropriated $10 billion for FY 2019. And so we were able to do things like the competitive highway bridge program, which provided states that have areas where there are fewer than 100 people per square mile some additional dollars for bridges. So you mentioned so many of these bridges are owned by counties, and what county is replete with funds to pay for bridges? They're not many. The point of programs like that is to address the bridges before they fail, and that's what we hope to do.
In Arizona, our DOT developed what they call the key commerce corridors. So in the event that additional revenue was to materialize, there are already prioritized those improvements along those key stretches of interstate and highway that would best maximize Arizona's economic opportunities that are available to them. So I think that linkage between infrastructure improvements and economic growth is vital and something that should be a key component of any state's infrastructure planning, in addition to and we are very appreciative of the emphasis on safety. I think the economic potential and safety are probably the two key areas that we need to really focus on going forward.
Great. Any other questions? Governor, you had lightning round ones last time. But, no. I'll just ask one other question, and this is in keeping with, was it Jake who talked about farming on the moon and Mars? Was it Jake? Yeah. So over the summer, I did a bike ride from Buffalo, New York to Albany, New York, along the Erie Canal. And it turns out there's 3 Erie Canals. There's the original one, low bridge, everybody down canal, and then there was an enlarged canal which was used for motorized, I guess, barges. And then there was the barge canal, which was built in 1923. And so if you think about the Erie Canal as this huge infrastructure investment that literally brought Western New York and frankly the East Coast and much of the West into the 20th century, right? And it opened everything up so you could get to the 20th century. It also created all these little small towns along the canal. And some of them are still doing well and some of them are not. But that was an audacious infrastructure investment. Do you all have any thoughts on an audacious infrastructure investment that would be akin to that in rural America in the 21st century? Because I think that's really what we need to be thinking. We can't be investing in infrastructure like we did in the 20th century or the 19th century. We need to be investing in like the 21st century and what rural communities are going to be like in the 21st century. So again, like Harry, what did he call it? A hairy audacious goal? Like what would be the hairy audacious goal to support the 21st century small towns and small town economies with infrastructure?
So I come from a railroad background, and as you know, the railroad replaced the Erie Canal.
Yeah, yes.
So, I would just say, and this is not to argue with your premise, but I think what we need to do, which would be audacious, is to actually spend money on the infrastructure needs that are so critical, like the bridges. And we're not responsible for the sewer system, but it's aging in many areas. There are things that are just aging in place, And it would be a wonderful thing if we could direct the dollars to fix that. And it's not sexy, and it's not necessarily going to get a ribbon cutting, and you're not going to have the mayor coming in to have streamers and parades and such. But it's stuff that is critical, and it would be audacious if we could come up with the dollars to spend on it.
So for me, it's very straightforward, especially in North Dakota. It's no fatalities on our state's highways or in our state at all. It's Vision Zero. You've heard about this program. That's our moonshot. That is something that we are going to strive for. That is something we are going to invest in. The engineering that it takes, the emergency preparedness and response that it takes, the education that it takes, the enforcement that it takes. It's Vision Zero. It's no more fatalities on North Dakota roads, and that's our audacious goal, and we intend to meet it.
Awesome.
I think that's an excellent goal. I also agree with Ann. We've got a lot of beautiful assets as far as you're talking about the recreational opportunities across the country, and we are developing border-to-border trail systems in our state. Yet, I think one of the challenges, and this gets back to the infrastructure, is if you want to hike a beautiful trail in Arizona, you don't want to have to hike 2 miles from where you got to park your car to the trailhead. You don't want to be stuck 80 miles from the Grand Canyon in traffic that's not moving. You want to see the Grand Canyon. So again, it gets back to the overall condition of the infrastructure out there. It should be much more high quality than the trend that we're currently on.
Great, thanks. Last question?
It's a lightning round question. It's been reported that there's more parking in America than the size of Connecticut. Because when we've been in love with automobiles, we're actually more in love with parking than we are automobiles, because there's about 10 or 12 parking spots for every automobile in America. With autonomous vehicles, Uber, Lyft, collaborative consumption, run autonomously, we're seeing for the first time drop in driver's license of young people getting driver's license. Used to be everybody got it the minute they turned 16, or North Dakota was 14. We're seeing that drop off. We're seeing car purchases like in the Bay Area, where there's extensive use of Uber and Lyft, dropping off for the first time. People getting rid of the third family car, starting to drop back. What does this have to do? Because sometimes it feels like we're still building transportation policy around a country that built all of its cities around automobiles, and it seems that the conversation we're having this morning is how do we build communities around people, and the technology is going to drive the demand for parking down. It's going to drive the demand for automobiles down. How do we plan for that future where the past is not prologue?
I have a thought. So that's an excellent question, and it's something that we've been working on for a while. I mean, I think many of us see the reduced demand for pavement and parking as great development opportunities. Number one. Number two, in order to get the number of parking spots reduced, well, there's a lot of different policy that we need to address, right? From zoning regulations, even in my county, Montgomery County, Maryland, which is supposed to be kind of progressive in planning, right? You have developers building buildings next to a metro and still having to provide the same number of parking spots as a apartment building that would be 5 miles away from a metro stop, and that costs money, and it's leading to the inaffordability of or the lack of affordability for housing, right? Developers are having to pay for parking spots. I think there's also the when it comes to autonomous vehicles, are they all going to be shared, or are people going to own their own and keep them, and they're going to have to keep them in certain places? There's a lot of things to sort out, but I think the bottom line is pavement equals opportunity, and if we have less demand and create less pavement for parking, then we're going to have better development opportunities in communities.
I would just say, I think you should meet people where they are, in the sense that there's some communities that can't afford to have a significant transit presence. Maybe what they can afford is bus rapid transit. So by all means, let's invest in bus rapid transit. Maybe they can't afford much more than micromobility, i.e. scooters. We don't want to socially engineer too much. What we want to do is make sure that people have a way to be mobile and get around. You know, the urban areas in the East and West Coast have had legacy systems where it absolutely makes sense that there's a less reliance on cars, but that doesn't hold true for every community. So I think where we want to do is make smart investments where we think that people will actually ride those systems, whatever they may be.
Yeah, I would say as lightning round. So I would say really, again, we can look at models that are already here. We look at communities and say, one of the ways that communities are healthy is that they have a diverse housing stock. So you have a variety of different kinds of housing for different people in different parts of in different places in their life and their economic and socioeconomic condition. Same thing with transportation. Is that very much what you had just said? Is the same thing with transportation. We develop a diverse, multimodal transportation stock that people can take advantage of, even in the smallest of communities. So so that everybody can be mobile and it can be safe. And it really doesn't matter what the weather is. They can still be mobile and they can still be safe. And so that's what I would say is mimic some of the things that are already here and just do more of them in the area of transportation.
And I think this gets back to our earlier question about the advancements in technology and the opportunities that provides for transportation going forward. And there's tremendous opportunity, but at the same time, I think it creates challenges for the planners. I think if you look at autonomous vehicles and how are they going to integrate with non-autonomous vehicles, what is the impact going to be on the need for parking spaces? Tremendous opportunity there, but those are all questions that clearly I think they're going to provide a challenge for localities and states.
I'm kind of
last word for
I'm kind of double lightning here, so sorry about that. But one of the things we forget sometimes is that walking is a really good way of transporting yourself around, and so creating communities that have better, even in rural communities, an ability to walk in a safe way and walk on a regular basis not only creates a better a sense of mobility, obviously, but also a healthier community. So we can't forget that you don't need a mechanism to move around. You can actually walk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening, and thank you all for being on the panel.
Thank you. You did a great job.